I've always been a bit of a tech nerd, spending countless nights surfing the web, dabbling in code, and exploring the darker corners of the internet. But nothing prepared me for the dark web. I thought I knew it all, thought I could handle it. Boy, was I wrong. It started innocently enough. My best friend Jake and I had been inseparable since childhood. We were like brothers, always pushing each other to the limits, but after a while, the competitiveness got out of hand. We started daring each other to do crazier and crazier things. It was all fun and games until I stumbled upon a forum about hiring hackers. That's when I got the idea. The dare was simple. Hire a hacker from the dark web and have them mess with our lives. It sounded like a thrilling prank, something to break the monotony of our mundane routines. We'd be scared, but we'd laugh it off later, right? So I went ahead and found a hacker. His alias was Red Fang, and he had a reputation for being ruthless and efficient. Perfect, I thought. I contacted Red Fang and paid him a substantial amount of Bitcoin. I told him to do whatever it took to ruin our lives, thinking it would be a harmless game. Red Fang agreed and promised he'd start immediately. The excitement and fear bubbled in my stomach as I waited for the first signs of his work. It began small, almost laughable. Jake's email got hacked, and he started receiving hundreds of spam emails daily. Then, my social media accounts were flooded with bizarre posts I hadn't made. We laughed about it, thinking it was just the beginning of a harmless prank. But things quickly took a darker turn. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly. Groggy, I picked it up and saw dozens of notifications. Someone had posted every embarrassing photo and video I had ever taken on my social media accounts. They'd even dug up some I had deleted years ago. The captions were vile, mocking my insecurities and failures. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the humiliating posts. Then came the texts. Random numbers sent me horrifying threats, describing how they were watching me, how they knew where I lived. They sent pictures of my house, taken from angles that suggested the sender was right outside. I freaked out, locking all my doors and windows, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my back. I couldn't sleep that night, too scared to close my eyes. Jake wasn't spared either. The next day, he called me, his voice shaking. Someone had hacked into his work computer and sent explicit emails to his boss and colleagues. They were grotesque, filled with disturbing content that got him fired on the spot. Jake was devastated, and I felt a pang of guilt. This was all my idea. Things escalated quickly from there. We started getting physical mail, packages filled with disgusting, rotting meat, dead animals, and even blood-soaked rags were delivered to our doors. The smell was unbearable, and the sight made me want to vomit. It wasn't funny anymore. It was terrifying. One night, I came home to find my front door wide open. Panic surged through me as I stepped inside, calling out, but no one answered. My apartment was trashed. Furniture was overturned, my belongings scattered everywhere, and on the wall, written in what looked like blood, was a chilling message. I'm inside. I ran out, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I called Jake, but he didn't answer. I drove to his place, praying he was okay. When I got there, his door was ajar too. I hesitated, fearing what I might find, but I had to check on him. Inside, the scene was eerily similar to my apartment. Jake's place was wrecked, and there was another message on the wall. "You're next!" I found Jake in his bathroom, trembling, clutching a baseball bat. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. We called the cops, but they couldn't do much. We had no idea who was behind this, and we couldn't exactly explain we had hired a hacker from the dark web to ruin our lives. We tried to stay together, thinking we'd be safer, but the harassment didn't stop. The hacker got bolder, more intrusive. Our bank accounts were drained, leaving us penniless. Our families received disturbing messages, making them fear for our safety. We were completely isolated, with no one to turn to. I began to realize the gravity of what I'd done. This wasn't a prank. It was a nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. Red Fang had taken the dare seriously, too seriously. And now, Jake and I were paying the price. We thought it couldn't get any worse, but it did. The final straw came when Jake went missing. I had stayed at my apartment for a night, trying to get some semblance of normalcy back. When I went to check on Jake the next day, he was gone. His apartment was a mess, but there was no sign of him. Just another message. Game over. I was frantic, calling his phone, searching everywhere, but he had vanished. Desperation drove me to contact Red Fang again, begging him to stop, to tell me where Jake was. He replied with a simple message. "This is what you wanted. I'm writing this now from a motel room, scared out of my mind. I don't know what to do. I've ruined both our lives, and I have no idea where Jake is or if he's even alive. I can't go to the police, can't explain what I did without sounding insane. I don't know how this will end, but I had to get it off my chest to warn others. Never, ever mess with the dark web. You don't know what you're inviting into your life, and sometimes a dare can turn into a living hell." After Jake went missing, my life spiraled into a deeper abyss. The guilt was eating me alive, and the fear of what might happen next was suffocating. Every creak, every shadow, every unfamiliar sound sent chills down my spine. I felt like a cornered animal, constantly on edge, waiting for the next horrific event. I couldn't stay in my apartment anymore. The memories of the trashed rooms and blood-written messages haunted me. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, using a fake name and paying in cash. I hoped I could stay hidden, just long enough to figure out a way out of this mess. The first night at the motel was a blur of paranoia and sleeplessness. The room was dingy, with a musty smell that clung to my clothes. The bed was lumpy, and the thin walls did nothing to muffle the sounds of the other guests. But it felt safer than my apartment, and that was all that mattered. I tried to think of a plan. Contacting Red Fang again seemed pointless. He'd made it clear he was done with me. Going to the police would only make things worse. They'd either think I was crazy or, worse, they'd start an investigation that would reveal my involvement in hiring the hacker. I was trapped, with no clear way out. Then, on the second night, I got a call. The motel phone rang at 2 a.m., jolting me from a restless sleep. My heart raced as I picked up the receiver, half expecting to hear Red Fang's voice. But it wasn't him. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Listen carefully," said a distorted voice on the other end. "If you want to find your friend, meet me at the old factory on the edge of town. Come alone, midnight." The line went dead before I could respond. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a trap? Was this some sick game? Or was there a chance this person could help me find Jake? Desperation won out over caution. I had to go. I spent the next day in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every sound, every shadow. As midnight approached, I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife I'd taken from the motel's tiny kitchenette. I didn't know what I'd be facing, but I wasn't going unarmed. The old factory was a relic from a bygone era, long abandoned and left to decay. It loomed in the darkness like a malevolent ghost, its broken windows and rusting walls giving it an eerie, sinister appearance. I parked my car a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. As I approached the entrance, I saw a figure standing just inside the doorway. My heart pounded in my chest as I tightened my grip on the flashlight and knife. The figure stepped forward, revealing a gaunt, middle-aged man with a haunted look in his eyes. "Are you the one who called me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded. "I'm Mark. I used to work with Red Fang. I know what he's capable of." "Where's Jake?" I demanded, my fear giving way to anger. Mark held up a hand. "Calm down. I'm here to help you. But you need to understand, this won't be easy. Red Fang doesn't leave loose ends. If he's taken your friend, it's because he wants something from you." "What does he want?" I asked, my stomach knotting with dread. Mark sighed. "Power. Control. He thrives on fear and chaos. He'll keep pushing you until you break. But there's a way to fight back. I can help you, but you'll need to trust me." I didn't have much choice. I agreed, and Mark led me deeper into the factory. He explained that he'd been part of a group that hired Red Fang years ago, but things had gone horribly wrong. Red Fang had turned on them, just like he was turning on me now. Mark had been hiding ever since, trying to stay one step ahead. We reached a small room at the back of the factory, where Mark had set up a makeshift command center. Old computers and monitors flickered with data, and papers were strewn across a dusty table. Mark sat down and started typing, bringing up files and images that made my blood run cold. "This is Red Fang's network," he explained. "He's got eyes everywhere, cameras, hacked devices, you name it. He's been watching you and Jake for weeks." He showed me footage of my apartment, of Jake's place, even of the motel room I was staying in. I felt violated, exposed. Red Fang had seen everything. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, suspicion creeping into my voice. Mark paused, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. Because I couldn't save my friends. They're all dead. Red Fang killed them, one by one. I can't let that happen to you and Jake. We spent hours going through the data, trying to find a way to track Red Fang. Mark taught me how to navigate the dark web, how to use encrypted communication, and how to stay hidden. It was overwhelming, but I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. Just as dawn was breaking, we found a lead, an IP address that might be connected to Red Fang. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Mark gave me a burner phone and told me to call him if anything happened. We agreed to meet again the next night to follow up on the lead. I left the factory feeling a mix of fear and determination. I had a plan, albeit a shaky one, and I wasn't alone anymore. But as I drove back to the motel, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, and my blood ran cold as I read it. You can't hide from me, I'm always watching. I glanced around, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. Red Fang was still out there, still pulling the strings, and I knew, deep down, that things were about to get much, much worse. I barely slept that day, the motel room feeling more like a prison cell with each passing hour. I kept the knife close, paranoid that Red Fang or one of his minions might burst through the door at any moment. My phone was on silent, but I checked it obsessively, half expecting another message from him. Each time I felt a sinking relief when there was nothing. When night fell, I met Mark at the factory again. We decided to follow the lead we'd found, an IP address that might point us to Red Fang's location. Mark had traced it to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place notorious for illegal activities. The thought of confronting Red Fang there filled me with dread, but I had no choice. I needed to find Jake. Mark and I drove separately, parking a few blocks away from the warehouse. The area was desolate, with broken streetlights and graffiti-covered walls. It was the kind of place where bad things happened, and no one asked questions. We approached the warehouse cautiously, keeping to the shadows. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it would give us away. Mark motioned for me to stay behind as he crept up to a side door. He fiddled with the lock, and after what felt like an eternity, it clicked open. The inside was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of decay and rust. We moved quietly, using our flashlights sparingly to avoid drawing attention. The warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, each corner hiding potential dangers. My anxiety was through the roof, every noise making me jump. We reached a small office at the back of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out. Mark motioned for me to stay back as he peeked inside. He nodded, indicating it was clear, and we entered. The office was a mess, papers and electronics strewn everywhere. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Mark sat down at the computer, trying to access its files. I stood guard, my eyes darting around the room, paranoid that Red Fang could appear at any moment. Mark's fingers flew over the keyboard, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. "I'm in," he whispered. "This might take a while. Keep an eye out." I nodded, gripping the knife tightly. The minutes dragged on, the silence oppressive. I strained to hear any sound that might indicate we'd been discovered. Finally, Mark let out a triumphant whisper. "I've got something. Coordinates, a place not far from here. This might be where Red Fang is hiding out." Just as he finished speaking, a noise from the warehouse made us both freeze. Footsteps, getting closer. Mark quickly shut down the computer, and we slipped out of the office, moving as silently as possible. We ducked behind a stack of crates, holding our breath as the footsteps approached. 2 men entered the office, speaking in low voices. "He's not here," one of them said. "But he was. We need to find him before he finds us." The other man cursed under his breath. "Red Fang won't be happy. We better move." They left the office, their footsteps fading into the distance. Mark and I exchanged a relieved glance and quietly made our way out of the warehouse. Once outside, we ran to our cars and drove to the new location, hoping this time we'd find Red Fang. The coordinates led us to an old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was a sprawling, decrepit place, its windows boarded up and its gates rusted shut. The place looked like something out of a horror movie, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. Mark and I parked a distance away and approached the mansion on foot. We climbed over the gate and made our way to the front door, which was surprisingly unlocked. Inside, the mansion was dark and silent, the air filled with the scent of mold and decay. We moved cautiously, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The mansion was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, each more unsettling than the last. Finally, we reached what appeared to be a basement door. Mark gestured for me to follow as he descended the creaking stairs. The basement was even colder than the rest of the mansion, and the smell of damp earth and rot was overpowering. We found ourselves in a large room filled with old furniture and cobwebs. At the far end of the room, a door stood ajar, light spilling out from within. We approached the door, my heart in my throat. Mark pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center was a chair, and in the chair was Jake, bound and gagged. His eyes widened in terror and relief when he saw us. We rushed to him, untying the ropes and removing the gag. "Jake, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jake nodded, tears streaming down his face. "It's a trap," he whispered. "He's coming. We need to get out of here." Before we could react, the door slammed shut behind us. A cold, menacing laugh echoed through the room. I spun around to see a figure standing in the shadows, his face obscured. "Leaving so soon?" the figure taunted. "I thought you wanted to play." Red Fang stepped into the light, revealing a face that was both familiar and terrifying. He looked ordinary, almost nondescript, but his eyes were cold and dead. He held a gun, pointing it directly at us. "You've been quite the challenge," Red Fang said, his voice dripping with malice. "But the game's over, and I always win." Mark lunged at Red Fang, but a gunshot rang out, and Mark fell to the ground, clutching his side. I screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a rusty pipe, and swung it at Red Fang. He dodged, laughing as he knocked the pipe from my hands. "You think you can beat me?" he sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Desperation and fear fueled my next move. I tackled Red Fang, the gun clattering to the floor. We struggled, rolling across the ground, each trying to gain the upper hand. Jake joined in, and together we managed to pin Red Fang down. But Red Fang was strong, unnaturally so. He threw us off with a burst of strength, grabbing the gun and aiming it at us. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. Then I remembered the knife in my pocket. In one swift motion, I pulled out the knife and plunged it into Red Fang's leg. He screamed, the gun firing wildly as he fell to the ground. I grabbed the gun, my hands shaking, and aimed it at him. "Stay down," I warned, my voice trembling. Red Fang laughed, a horrible, chilling sound. "You can't kill me. This isn't over. It's never over." With Mark injured and Jake barely able to stand, we fled the mansion, leaving Red Fang behind. We drove to the nearest hospital, where Mark was rushed into surgery. Jake and I waited, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving us exhausted and terrified. As I sat in the waiting room, I realized that Red Fang was right. This wasn't over. He would come after us again, and we needed to be prepared. But for now, we were alive, and that was all that mattered. We had survived the night, but I knew the nightmare was far from over. The waiting room was a sterile, quiet place, filled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional muffled sound of hospital staff moving about. Jake and I sat side by side, our minds reeling from the events of the night. We barely spoke, each lost in our own thoughts, haunted by Red Fang's menacing laughter and the horror of what we had just survived. Mark was in surgery for hours. The sun had risen by the time a doctor finally approached us, his face etched with fatigue. "He's stable," the doctor said. "He lost a lot of blood, but he's a fighter. He's in recovery now, and you can see him soon." Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. We knew we couldn't stay in one place for long. Red Fang would come after us, and we had to be ready. I called my parents, inventing a story about a sudden trip out of town, and told them I wouldn't be reachable for a while. Jake did the same with his family. We couldn't risk endangering them by letting them know what was really happening. When Mark finally woke up, he was weak but lucid. He insisted we come up with a plan, despite his condition. We gathered around his hospital bed, discussing our next move in hushed tones. "Red Fang won't stop," Mark said, his voice raspy. "He thrives on fear and chaos. We need to take the fight to him, but we need to be smart about it." We decided to lay low for a few days, giving Mark time to recover while we prepared. We found a secluded cabin outside the city, using cash to avoid leaving a trail. The cabin was rustic and isolated, surrounded by dense woods that provided a natural barrier against intruders. Jake and I took turns keeping watch, barely sleeping, always on high alert. We stocked up on supplies, fortified the cabin, and set up a basic surveillance system using equipment Mark had procured. The days blurred together, a haze of anxiety and preparation. One night, as I sat by the window with a pair of binoculars, I noticed something strange, a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to see more clearly. It was a drone, hovering just above the treetops, its red light blinking ominously. "Jake! Mark! Get over here!" I hissed, my voice low but urgent. They rushed to my side, their faces pale as they saw the drone. "He's found us!" Jake muttered, his voice filled with dread. Mark grabbed a shotgun we had kept for protection. "Stay inside," he ordered. "I'll take it down." He stepped outside, aiming the shotgun at the drone. The first shot missed, but the second hit its mark. The drone sputtered and crashed to the ground, its red light fading. We rushed out to inspect it, finding a small camera attached. "He's watching us," Mark said grimly. "We need to move, now." We packed our things quickly, leaving the cabin and driving to a new location. A safe house Mark had set up years ago, hidden deep in the woods. It was even more remote than the cabin, with no electricity or running water. But it was secure, and that was all that mattered. The safe house was small and cramped, but we made do. Mark's condition was improving, and he used his knowledge to set up traps and defenses around the perimeter. We couldn't afford to let our guard down, not even for a moment. Days turned into weeks, and we lived in a constant state of fear. Red Fang's presence loomed over us, an invisible threat that kept us on edge. We communicated with the outside world sparingly, using encrypted messages to avoid detection. Then, one night, everything changed. I was on watch duty, scanning the woods with a pair of night vision goggles, when I saw them. Figures moving silently through the trees. My heart raced as I counted at least 5 of them, armed and moving with purpose. "Guys, we've got company," I whispered, waking Mark and Jake. We grabbed our weapons and took up positions around the safe house, our hearts pounding in our chests. The figures closed in, their movements deliberate and coordinated. They knew we were here. The first attack came suddenly. A Molotov cocktail shattered against the side of the safe house, flames licking at the wooden walls. We fought back, shooting at the intruders, but they were relentless. The safe house was surrounded, and the fire was spreading quickly. "We need to get out of here," Mark shouted, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. We grabbed what we could and fled through a hidden escape tunnel Mark had built. The tunnel led us to a nearby river, where we plunged into the icy water and swam downstream, the sounds of gunfire and flames fading behind us. We emerged on the other side, cold and exhausted, but alive. We stumbled through the woods, putting as much distance between us and the burning safe house as possible. Finally, we found a small cave where we could rest and catch our breath. "We can't keep running," Jake said, his voice shaky. "We need to end this, for good." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. We need to find Red Fang and take him down." We spent the next few days planning our counterattack. Mark had managed to recover some data from the crashed drone, which gave us a possible location for Red Fang's hideout, a remote bunker in the mountains, heavily fortified and guarded. It was a suicide mission, but we had no other choice. We armed ourselves with everything we could find: guns, knives, makeshift explosives, and set out for the bunker. The journey was long and treacherous, but we pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. As we approached the bunker, we knew this was it, the final showdown. Our hearts pounded with anticipation, knowing that one way or another, this would end tonight. The mountain air was thin and cold as we approached Red Fang's bunker, our breaths forming clouds in the frigid night. The entrance was hidden among the rocks, but Mark's data led us right to it. The bunker was a relic from some forgotten war, its steel door covered in rust and vines. We knew once we stepped inside, there was no turning back. Mark rigged a small explosive to the door. We took cover behind a boulder as the charge went off, the explosion echoing through the mountains. The door blew open, revealing a dark corridor that descended into the earth. We moved quickly, our footsteps echoing off the cold concrete walls. The bunker was a maze of tunnels and rooms lit by flickering, dim lights. It was eerily silent, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. We crept forward, our senses on high alert, every shadow and sound setting our nerves on edge. We reached a large room filled with old computer equipment and surveillance monitors. The screens flickered with images from different locations. Our homes, the hospital, even the safe house before it was attacked. Red Fang had been watching us the entire time. "He's here," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. We spread out, searching the room for any sign of Red Fang. Suddenly, a door at the far end of the room swung open, and a figure stepped out, his face hidden behind a mask. He clapped slowly, the sound echoing ominously in the enclosed space. "Bravo!" Red Fang said, his voice distorted through the mask. "I must admit, you've been quite entertaining." Anger surged through me. "Where's Jake?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the gun. Red Fang laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Jake? He's just the bait. This was always about you." Before I could react, a trapdoor in the floor opened, and Jake was pushed up, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with fear. 2 armed men flanked him, their guns trained on us. "Let him go," Mark said, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he felt. Red Fang shook his head. "This ends now. You wanted to play a game, and you lost. It's time to pay the price." In a flash, everything descended into chaos. Mark threw a smoke bomb, filling the room with a thick, choking cloud. Gunfire erupted, the deafening sound echoing off the walls. I lunged toward Jake, grabbing him and pulling him to the floor, shielding him with my body. Through the smoke, I saw Red Fang retreating, his form barely visible. I couldn't let him escape. I had to end this. I handed Jake my knife and whispered, "Cut yourself free and stay down." I moved through the smoke, following Red Fang into another corridor. The gunfire and shouts faded behind me as I chased him deeper into the bunker. The corridor twisted and turned, and I almost lost him several times, but my anger and desperation kept me going. Finally, I cornered him in a small, dimly lit room. Red Fang turned to face me, his mask reflecting the dim light. "You think you can stop me?" he taunted. "You have no idea what I've done, what I'm capable of." I raised my gun, my hands shaking. "This ends now," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Red Fang laughed again, a sound that would haunt my dreams for years. "You can't kill me. I'm a ghost, a shadow. I'll haunt you forever." In that moment, something snapped inside me. I squeezed the trigger, the gunshot echoing through the room. Red Fang staggered, clutching his chest, and fell to the floor. I stood there, breathing heavily, watching as the life drained from his eyes. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door behind me burst open, and Jake and Mark rushed in. Jake was free from his bindings, his face pale and drawn. Mark looked exhausted, his side still bandaged from the gunshot wound. "It's over," I said, my voice hollow. "It's finally over." We left the bunker, the early morning light breaking over the mountains. The nightmare had ended, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. We returned to the hospital to treat our injuries and ensure Mark's recovery. In the following days, we went to the police with a carefully crafted story that omitted our involvement with Red Fang. They investigated the bunker and found enough evidence to close the case on several unsolved crimes, but we knew better than to reveal the whole truth. Jake and I tried to piece our lives back together, but things were never the same. The fear and paranoia lingered, and every shadow, every unexpected noise brought back memories of our ordeal. We remained close, our shared trauma forging an unbreakable bond, but the carefree days of our friendship were gone forever. As for Mark, he disappeared shortly after leaving the hospital. He left a note saying he needed to go off the grid for a while to ensure Red Fang's associates wouldn't come after him. We never heard from him again, but I like to think he's out there somewhere, watching, ready to help if we ever needed him. I learned a hard lesson from all of this. Some things are better left alone. The dark web, the thrill of the dare, the desire to push boundaries, it wasn't worth the cost. I would never forget the nightmare I unleashed, and I would never forgive myself for what I put us through. So, to anyone reading this, take my advice. Never, ever mess with forces you don't understand. Because sometimes, the monsters you invite in are far worse than the ones you fear. I guess I should start by saying I'm not one for the outdoors. I mean, I'm not completely hopeless, but you wouldn't catch me camping or hiking for fun. So, when I woke up in the middle of a dense forest with no memory of how I got there, I was understandably freaked out. I opened my eyes to the sound of rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. My head was pounding. my mouth dry, and there was this metallic taste lingering on my tongue. I tried to sit up, but my body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. Every muscle screamed in protest. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The forest floor was littered with decaying leaves and underbrush. There was no path, no sign of civilization, just endless woods. The first thing I noticed was that I was barefoot. My shoes were gone, and my clothes were ripped and filthy. Panic set in as I tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was being at a bar with some friends. We'd been drinking, laughing, the usual weekend routine. Then, nothing. A complete blank until now. I stumbled to my feet, every step sending jolts of pain through my body. My mind raced with questions. Had I been kidnapped? Drugged? Dumped here for some sick game? I had no idea. All I knew was that I needed to find a way out, fast. Hours passed as I wandered aimlessly, calling out for help until my voice was hoarse. But there was nothing. No response, no sign of other people. Just the oppressive silence of the forest. I tried to stay calm, to think logically. If I kept walking in one direction, I'd eventually find something, right? As the sun began to set, a new kind of fear gripped me. The forest, already eerie in the daylight, transformed into something out of a nightmare as darkness fell. The temperature dropped, and I realized I had no way to stay warm. I gathered some sticks and dry leaves, trying to start a fire with the little survival knowledge I had. But my hands were shaking too much, and I could barely focus. That's when I heard it. A soft whispering, almost too faint to catch. I froze, straining to hear. It was coming from somewhere behind me. Slowly I turned, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and the dim light of the setting sun. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence, then the sound of twigs snapping nearby. Something was out there, watching me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Another person? I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned and ran, ignoring the pain in my feet and legs. I just needed to get away, to find somewhere safe. Eventually, I came across a small clearing. In the center was a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls covered in moss and vines. It looked abandoned, but I didn't care. I needed shelter, somewhere to hide. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. There was a single room, furnished with a broken table and a couple of chairs. In the corner, a tattered mattress lay on the floor. I collapsed onto it, my body too exhausted to care about the dirt and grime. As I lay there, trying to catch my breath, I heard the whispering again. This time, it was clearer, almost like a chant. My skin crawled, and I pulled the thin blanket over me, trying to block out the sound. But it kept getting louder, more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. After what felt like hours, the whispering finally faded, leaving me in an uneasy silence. I didn't sleep much that night, too afraid of what might be lurking outside. When morning came, I felt a little more hopeful. Maybe I could find something useful in the cabin, some clue about where I was or how to get out. I searched every inch, but there was nothing. No food, no maps, nothing to indicate that anyone had lived here for a long time. Frustrated, I stepped outside, squinting in the harsh sunlight. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading away from the cabin and into the forest. They were fresh, too fresh to be mine from the night before. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here, watching me. The realization made me feel sick. I was not alone in these woods, and whoever else was out there, they didn't want to be found. I followed the footprints cautiously, my mind racing with thoughts of who or what I might find. The trail led me deeper into the forest, to a place where the trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dark tunnel. As I entered, the air grew colder, and the whispering started again. This time, it was all around me, echoing through the trees. I tried to stay calm, to focus on the footprints, but my fear was overwhelming. I felt like I was being pulled into some kind of twisted nightmare. Then I saw it. A small clearing up ahead with something in the center. As I got closer, I realized it was a large wooden crate, covered in dirt and leaves. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was inside. I reached out with trembling hands and pried the lid open. Inside, there was a laptop, still on and displaying some kind of chat room. I picked it up, my mind racing with questions. Who had left this here? Why? As I scrolled through the messages, my blood ran cold. It was a dark web auction, and I was the item being sold. There were photos of me, unconscious, tied up, descriptions of my physical state, and bids from various users. The last message sent a chill down my spine. Sold, delivery in 24 hours. I dropped the laptop, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. How had I ended up here? Who had done this to me? And more importantly, how was I going to get out? I turned and ran, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that crate as possible. But no matter how far I went, the whispering followed, growing louder and more menacing. I was trapped in this nightmare, with no way out. As night fell again, I found myself back at the cabin, the whispering now a constant presence. I barricaded the door, trying to create some sense of safety. But deep down, I knew it was futile. Whatever was out there, it wouldn't stop until it had me. I sat on the floor, clutching a makeshift weapon, a broken piece of wood, waiting for the inevitable. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. How had my life turned into this horror show? Then, the whispering stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. I held my breath, listening. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just outside the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the piece of wood tighter, ready to fight for my life. But deep down, I knew it was hopeless. Whatever was out there, it was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The growling outside the door grew louder, more insistent. My grip on the makeshift weapon tightened, my knuckles turning white. I could hear something scratching at the wood, a slow, deliberate sound that sent chills down my spine. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Some kind of predator? Or was it something worse? Something I couldn't even begin to imagine. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had to be smart. Had to think clearly if I wanted to survive this. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my eyes scanning the room for anything that could help. There was nothing but broken furniture and debris. My gaze fell on the window. It was small, but if I could get it open, maybe I could slip out and make a run for it. I moved towards the window, trying to be as quiet as possible. The scratching at the door continued, a maddening rhythm that seemed to echo inside my skull. I reached the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck, the wood swollen from years of neglect. I gritted my teeth and pushed harder, the frame creaking under the strain. Then, with a sudden snap, the window gave way and I stumbled backwards, nearly falling. I glanced at the door. The growling had stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door shuddered, as if something heavy had slammed into it. I didn't wait to see what it was. I climbed through the window, scraping my arms on the rough wood, and dropped to the ground outside. I took off running, my bare feet pounding against the forest floor. Branches tore at my clothes, and the underbrush scratched my legs, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. The whispering had started again, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They were taunting me, mocking my fear. I didn't stop until I reached a small stream. Gasping for breath, I knelt by the water and splashed my face, trying to clear my head. The cold water was a shock to my system, but it helped me focus. I needed a plan, some way to figure out where I was and how to get out of this nightmare. As I sat by the stream, I noticed something in the water. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, a reflection, faint but unmistakable. I leaned closer, squinting to see better. There, in the water, was a face. Not my face, but someone else's, staring back at me with hollow eyes. I scrambled backwards, my heart racing. The face in the water disappeared, leaving only ripples behind. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind, brought on by fear and exhaustion? Then, I heard a voice. Not the whispering this time, but a clear, distinct voice. It was coming from somewhere nearby, a low, gravelly tone that sent shivers down my spine. "Help me!" I turned towards the sound, my fear momentarily forgotten. Someone else was out here, someone who needed help. I followed the voice, moving cautiously through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening with every step. I reached another clearing, and there, in the center, was a man. He was tied to a tree, his clothes torn and bloodied. His head hung low, his hair matted with dirt and grime. As I approached, he lifted his head, and I saw the same hollow eyes that had stared at me from the water. "Please," he whispered, his voice weak. "Help me!" I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't just leave him there. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached out to untie him, he looked up at me, and his eyes widened in terror. "No! It's a trap!" he gasped, but it was too late. Something cold and sharp wrapped around my ankle, yanking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs. I struggled to get free, but whatever had hold of me was strong, dragging me across the forest floor. I clawed at the ground, trying to find something to hold on to. My fingers dug into the dirt, but it was no use. I was being pulled towards the trees, towards the darkness. Then, with a sudden jolt, I was free. I scrambled to my feet, looking around wildly. The man was gone, the clearing empty. It was as if he had never been there. My ankle throbbed, and I could see a thin line of blood where the thing had grabbed me. I limped away, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Nothing made sense. The whispering, the voices, the man. Were they real, or was I losing my mind? I didn't know, and that terrified me more than anything else. I kept moving, my thoughts racing. I had to find a way out, had to figure out what was happening. But no matter how far I went, the forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of shadows and fear. The whispering followed me, a constant reminder that I was not alone. As night fell again, I found myself back at the stream. I sat down, exhausted and defeated. I didn't know how much more I could take. My body was battered, my mind on the verge of breaking. I needed help, but there was no one to turn to. That's when I remembered the laptop, the dark web auction. Someone had bought me, planned to deliver me. If I could find a way to contact them, maybe I could get some answers, find a way out of this nightmare. I searched the area, hoping to find some sign of the crate. It didn't take long. Hidden among the trees, I found it, the laptop still inside. I opened it, my hands shaking. The screen glowed in the darkness, the chat room still active. I typed a message, my desperation clear in every word. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, a message appeared on the screen. "You were chosen. Prepare for delivery." My blood ran cold. Chosen? For what? I didn't get a chance to find out. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and the darkness of the forest. Then, a hand clamped over my mouth, and everything went black. I woke up in a small, dimly lit room, my hands and feet bound. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. I tried to move, but the restraints were too tight. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whoever had taken me. The door creaked open and a figure stepped inside, tall and thin, their face hidden in shadow. They moved closer, and I could see the glint of a knife in their hand. My heart raced, and I struggled against the restraints, but it was no use. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You've been chosen for a very special purpose." Terror washed over me as the figure raised the knife. I had no idea what they planned to do, but I knew it wasn't going to end well. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. And then, with a sudden jolt, the world went dark. I woke up to a blinding pain in my head and the sound of my own breathing, ragged and labored. My wrists were raw from the restraints, and my body ached from head to toe. I was still in the same dimly lit room, but the figure with the knife was gone. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The room was small, with bare concrete walls and a single door. There were no windows, no way to tell if it was day or night. I struggled to sit up, my body protesting with every movement. The ropes around my wrists and ankles were tight, but I managed to wriggle enough to loosen them slightly. With a final, desperate effort, I slipped free and collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. I knew I had to get out of there, but my mind was still foggy, my thoughts disjointed. I stumbled to my feet, using the wall for support, and made my way to the door. It was locked, of course, but there had to be another way out. I searched the room, my heart pounding in my chest. In the corner, hidden behind a pile of old, rotting blankets, I found a small ventilation shaft. It was a tight squeeze, but it was my only chance. I crawled inside, the metal edges scraping against my skin, and began to move through the narrow tunnel. The air was stale and musty, and I had to fight back the urge to panic. As I crawled, I heard something. A low, rhythmic chanting, echoing through the walls. It sent chills down my spine, and I moved faster, desperate to get away from the sound. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but finally, I saw a faint light up ahead. I crawled towards it, my heart racing with hope. I emerged into another room, this one larger and filled with strange, ritualistic symbols painted on the walls. Candles flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, stained with dark, dried blood. My stomach turned at the sight. I looked around, trying to find an exit. There was a door on the far side of the room, but as I moved towards it, I heard the chanting again, closer this time. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and I ducked behind the table, praying I wouldn't be seen. A group of figures entered, their faces hidden by dark hooded robes. They moved in unison, their voices blending together in a haunting, otherworldly chant. They circled the table, and I realized with horror that they were preparing for some kind of ritual. I had to get out of there, but there was no way I could slip past them without being seen. I looked around, desperate for another way out. That's when I noticed a small hidden door behind a tapestry on the wall. I moved quietly, trying to stay out of sight, and slipped through the door. I found myself in another tunnel, this one leading upwards. I climbed as quickly as I could, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The chanting grew fainter, and I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I could escape. Maybe I could find help. The tunnel opened up into a small, musty room. There was a single window, boarded up, but I could see a faint glimmer of light through the cracks. I grabbed a piece of wood and pried the boards loose, my hands shaking with the effort. Finally, the boards gave way, and I climbed through the window, dropping to the ground outside. I was back in the forest, the familiar trees and underbrush surrounding me. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at me. I started to run, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning with the effort. The forest seemed endless, a never-ending maze of trees and darkness. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my feet torn and bleeding, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached a clearing and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The forest was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. There was a small cabin on the other side of the clearing, its windows dark and foreboding. I didn't have any other options. I made my way to the cabin, my legs barely able to support me. The door was unlocked, and I pushed it open, stepping inside. The interior was dark and musty, but it seemed empty. I sank to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion. I had to figure out what was happening, why I had been taken, and who was behind it all. But first, I needed to rest. I needed to gather my strength and try to make sense of everything. As I lay there, my mind racing, I heard the whispering again, faint but unmistakable. "Welcome back," it said, and I felt a cold, creeping dread settle over me. I was not alone. I would never be alone. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hooded figures, the blood-stained table, the face in the water. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Morning came, and with it, a renewed sense of determination. I couldn't stay here, couldn't let the fear consume me. I had to find a way out, had to get help. I searched the cabin, hoping to find something useful. In a drawer, I found a rusty knife and a map, faded and worn, but still legible. The map showed the layout of the forest, with a path leading to a nearby town. It was my only hope. I grabbed the knife and the map, and I started walking. The forest was still and silent, the whispering a constant companion in the back of my mind. I followed the path, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I knew they were out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment. As I walked, I saw something up ahead, a figure, standing in the middle of the path. My heart leapt into my throat, and I tightened my grip on the knife. As I got closer, I realized it was a man, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes wide with fear. "Help me!" he pleaded, his voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me!" I approached cautiously, my mind racing. Was this another trap? Another hallucination? I couldn't be sure, but I couldn't just leave him there. I reached out, and as soon as I touched his arm, he collapsed to the ground, sobbing. "They took us!" he gasped. "They took us, and they're going to kill us! You have to get away! You have to run!" I helped him to his feet, my mind reeling with questions. Who was he? How had he ended up here? But there was no time for answers. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I knew we had to move. We started running, the man leaning on me for support. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer, the shadows deepening. The path twisted and turned, and I struggled to keep my bearings. Then, we saw it. A light, faint but unmistakable, up ahead. The edge of the forest. Safety. We pushed ourselves harder, desperation giving us strength. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We burst out of the forest and into the open, the bright sunlight blinding us. We stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. We were free, but the nightmare was far from over. The man turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaking. "Thank you for saving me." I nodded, my mind still reeling. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never be the same. The forest had changed me, scarred me in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. As we made our way towards the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The whispering had stopped, but the fear remained, a constant gnawing presence in the back of my mind. I knew we had escaped, but I also knew that the nightmare was far from over. The forest, the whispering, the hooded figures, they would haunt me forever, and I would never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment they came for me again. We reached the edge of the forest and saw the town in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was tainted by the nagging fear that we weren't truly free. The man, who introduced himself as Alex, was still shaky, his eyes darting around like a hunted animal. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. As we stumbled into the main street, people stopped and stared. We must have looked like we'd crawled out of hell, which, in a way, we had. An elderly woman approached us, her face lined with concern. "What happened to you two?" she asked, her voice gentle. Alex tried to explain, but his words came out in a jumbled mess. I stepped in, my voice steady despite the fear still coursing through me. "We were lost in the forest. We need help. Please, can you take us to the police?" She nodded and led us to the small police station at the end of the street. The officer on duty, a burly man with a thick mustache, eyed us suspiciously as we entered. I explained what had happened, leaving out the parts that seemed too insane to believe. Kidnapped, lost, and finally escaped. That much was true. The officer called for backup, and soon we were sitting in a small interrogation room, sipping on cups of hot coffee. Alex was visibly trembling, and I couldn't tell if it was from fear or the cold. I tried to reassure him, but my own nerves were frayed. An investigator, Detective Ramirez, arrived shortly after. He was tall and lean, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. He listened intently as I recounted our ordeal, his expression growing darker with each detail. "We've had reports of strange activities in that forest before," he said, more to himself than to us. "Disappearances, odd sightings, but nothing concrete, until now." He stood up and left the room, leaving us alone with our thoughts. The silence was oppressive, and the flickering fluorescent light above us did little to calm my nerves. I glanced at Alex, who was staring blankly at the table. "Do you remember anything?" I asked him quietly. "Anything that could help us figure out who did this?" Alex shook his head. "Just voices, chanting, and those eyes. I can't get them out of my head." We sat in silence until Detective Ramirez returned. He had a grim look on his face and a folder in his hands. He placed it on the table and opened it, revealing photographs of other missing persons. My heart sank as I recognized a few of them from the forest, faces I had seen in my nightmares. "These people," Ramirez said, tapping the photos. "They disappeared under similar circumstances. We never found any leads, but your story might change that." He asked us to describe everything we could remember, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. As I spoke, the images of the hooded figures, the dark rituals, and the whispering voices played in my mind like a twisted movie. Ramirez listened intently, jotting down notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "We need to go back," he said finally. "We need to find that place and gather evidence." The thought of returning to the forest filled me with dread, but I knew he was right. We couldn't let this happen to anyone else. Reluctantly, I agreed, and Alex nodded, though he looked like he might pass out at any moment. The next day, we were back at the edge of the forest, this time with a team of officers and a few volunteers from the town. The sun was shining, but the trees still cast long, menacing shadows. As we ventured into the woods, the familiar feeling of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. We followed the path I had taken, my memory guiding us through the dense underbrush. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We reached the clearing where I had found the man tied to the tree, but there was no sign of him now. The bloodstains on the ground were the only evidence that something terrible had happened here. Detective Ramirez ordered his team to spread out and search the area. Hours passed, with no sign of the hooded figures or the ritual site. Frustration and fear gnawed at me. Had we been led on a wild goose chase? Was this all some elaborate trick? Then, one of the officers called out, "Over here! I found something!" We rushed over to find a hidden trapdoor, covered with leaves and branches. It was old and heavy, but with some effort we managed to pry it open. A ladder led down into the darkness, and the smell of damp earth and decay wafted up. Ramirez went down first, followed by the rest of us. The tunnel was narrow and dark, the air thick with the scent of mold. We moved cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The tunnel opened up into a large underground chamber. My heart pounded as I recognized the ritual symbols painted on the walls, the blood-stained table in the center. This was it. This was the place. The officers spread out, documenting everything. Ramirez took photos of the symbols, his expression grim. "We've found our evidence," he said. "But where are they?" As if in response, the whispering started again, louder and more insistent than ever. The air grew cold, and a sense of dread settled over us. The walls seemed to close in, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. Then, we saw them. The hooded figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved silently, their faces hidden in darkness. My heart raced as they surrounded us, their whispering voices blending together in a haunting chant. "Back off!" Ramirez shouted, drawing his gun. The officers followed suit, but the figures didn't flinch. They moved closer, their voices growing louder, more menacing. I felt a hand grab my arm, and I turned to see Alex, his face pale with fear. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Now." We backed away, the figures closing in. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Just as it seemed they would overwhelm us, a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. The figures froze, their eyes wide with shock. Then, with a sudden rush of air, they vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. The whispering stopped, and the oppressive weight lifted. Ramirez lowered his gun, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, my mind reeling. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here, now." We hurried back through the tunnel, the fear still gnawing at us. As we emerged into the daylight, I felt a strange sense of relief. We had survived, but I knew the nightmare was far from over. The forest was silent, the shadows long and menacing. We made our way back to the town, the events of the day replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of those hooded figures, that they were still out there, watching, waiting. As we reached the town, Detective Ramirez turned to me. "We're not done yet," he said. "We'll need to investigate further, gather more evidence. But for now, you're safe." Safe. The word felt hollow, meaningless. I knew I would never truly be safe, not as long as those figures were out there. The whispering still echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the horrors I had witnessed. I nodded, my thoughts far away. The town seemed peaceful, normal, but I knew better. The darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And I would never stop looking over my shoulder, never stop waiting for the moment it came for me again. Back in the town, they put Alex and me up in a small guest house near the police station. Detective Ramirez arranged for a couple of officers to keep watch, but it did little to ease my nerves. Every creak, every rustle outside made my heart skip a beat. Alex was no better. He jumped at shadows, his eyes darting around as if expecting those hooded figures to burst in at any moment. We tried to get some sleep, but nightmares haunted us both. I dreamt of the forest, the whispering voices, and the glowing eyes. I woke up drenched in sweat, my pulse racing, and it took a moment to remind myself that I wasn't back in that nightmare. The next morning, Detective Ramirez called us to the station. They had found more evidence in the underground chamber. Old books, strange artifacts, and more of those ritualistic symbols. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Ramirez handed me a photograph, taken in the chamber. It was of a symbol painted on the wall, one that I hadn't noticed before. It was an intricate design, with lines and curves that seemed to shift and move as I looked at it. "We believe this is some kind of summoning or binding ritual," Ramirez explained, "but we're not sure what it's for. Do either of you recognize it?" I shook my head, but Alex gasped, his face going pale. "I've seen that before," he whispered, "in my dreams. It was calling to me." Ramirez's expression grew more serious. "We need to figure out what this means. There's a local historian who might be able to help. I'll arrange for you to meet him." We spent the day trying to relax, but it was impossible. The town felt different, darker, as if the events in the forest had tainted it. People avoided our gaze, whispering among themselves as we walked by. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That evening, Ramirez drove us to the historian's house on the outskirts of town. The man, Dr. Harlan, was old, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes. He invited us into his study, a cluttered room filled with books and strange artifacts. Ramirez showed him the photograph of the symbol. Dr. Harlan's eyes widened, and he leaned in closer, examining it with a magnifying glass. "This is ancient," he said, his voice hushed. "Very ancient. It's a binding symbol, used to trap spirits or entities in a specific location." My heart pounded in my chest. "What kind of entities?" Dr. Harlan looked at me, his eyes grave, dark ones. "Malevolent spirits that feed on fear and pain. They can be summoned, but they require sacrifices to remain bound." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. Ramirez frowned. "So, these rituals, they're to keep these spirits trapped?" Harlan nodded. "Yes, but it's dangerous. If the ritual is not performed correctly, or if the bindings are weakened, the spirits can break free." Alex trembled beside me. "That's what they were doing. The hooded figures. They were trying to keep the spirits bound." Ramirez's expression was grim. "We need to stop this." "But how?" Dr. Harlan sighed. "There's only one way to permanently end this. The ritual must be performed again, but this time the symbols must be destroyed immediately afterward. It's risky, but it's the only way." The thought of going back to the forest filled me with dread, but I knew we had no choice. We had to end this, once and for all. The next day, we prepared for the ritual. Dr. Harlan provided us with the necessary tools and instructions. Ramirez gathered a team of officers, and we set out for the forest, determined to put an end to the nightmare. The forest was eerily silent as we made our way to the underground chamber. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like a march to the gallows. We reached the trapdoor and climbed down, our flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. In the chamber, the symbols seemed to glow with a malevolent light. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. And the whispering started again, more insistent than ever. We moved quickly, setting up the ritual as Dr. Harlan had instructed. As we began the ritual, the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around us. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. I focused on the symbols, drawing them with careful precision, while Ramirez and his team stood guard. Then, it happened. The air around us shimmered, and the hooded figures appeared, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved towards us, their whispering voices blending into a haunting chant. "Keep going!" Ramirez shouted, firing his gun at the figures. The bullets passed through them, as if they were made of smoke. I finished the last symbol and stepped back, my heart pounding. Dr. Harlan had given us a special powder to destroy the symbols. I grabbed the pouch and scattered the powder over the symbols, watching as they sizzled and burned. The hooded figures screamed, a sound that echoed through the chamber and sent chills down my spine. The air grew thick with smoke, and I felt a sudden pressure in my head, as if something was trying to break free. Then, with a final, deafening roar, the figures vanished, and the whispering stopped. The chamber was silent, the oppressive weight lifted. We climbed out of the tunnel, gasping for breath. The sun was rising, casting a warm light over the forest. It was over. We had done it. Back in town, we were hailed as heroes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The darkness had left its mark on me, a shadow that would never fully disappear. Alex and I decided to leave town, to start fresh somewhere far away from the memories of the forest. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us. But there was nothing. Just the road stretching out ahead of us. We were free, but the nightmare would always be with us, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of the light. And as we drove into the sunrise, I knew one thing for sure. I would never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment when the shadows came for me again.